Well, good morning. I'm Bill Roach. I chair the Environment Committee, and along with the First Hill unit of the League of Women Voters, we've invited actually all three of our senator and two representatives. Unfortunately, Representative Nicole Macri couldn't make it today. She had an impending meeting in Olympia. So, but we do have our senator who has just been elected the majority leader of the Senate. And Representative Scott, elect Scott, who will be starting his first term in January, and so I have a long introduction, but I won't make it since I think you most know, certainly Senator Pedersen, who, by the way, has been our representative, has represented us since 2006, first as a representative and then in 2013 and on as our senator. And I'll talk about Representative Scott in a minute, but Senator, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, should I start on the session already, or do you want to do the introduction first?
No, you go ahead.
All right. Let's see. There we go. Good morning, everybody. Happy holidays. It is a delight to be back here with you. I think this is a long tradition for us. I'm delighted to have Representative Scott with me today, although I have to say I'm very sad after 18 years of serving with Speaker Chopp to have him just be back to being a private citizen again. I think he will continue to darken our doors or lighten our doors. He's already busy advocating on a whole bunch of fronts, and I speak to him most weeks about various things that he's cooking up for the upcoming session. We have in front of us a very challenging session. I think, we're facing a big budget shortfall over the next 4 years in the operating budget. Estimates range somewhere in the neighborhood of $11, $12, $13 billion of a shortfall. And then on the transportation budget, over the next 10 years, we have a roughly $8 billion shortfall. So a significant problem, and that's just to fund the existing services that the state is providing and what we have programmed in terms of increases for childcare and early learning, for example. It doesn't do anything about the additional needs that we know are present, for example, in our public schools, where Seattle Public Schools has a roughly $100 million shortfall in the coming year, nearly all of which is due to the state's failure to fund special education, materials, supplies, and operating costs, and student transportation. So we have a proposal from the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction that would be a roughly $3 billion per biennium addition to public schools. So, add another $6 billion to that number that we have short. And you can see that we're facing a pretty significant challenge in the upcoming session. We are and have been for several months already in the process of scrubbing the budget, trying to figure out whether there are things that we can stop doing that we've been doing, programs that no longer make sense, or where we can save money. And we'll do that work diligently and continue to do that scrubbing. I will say there is, in my judgment, no way that we are going to come up with billions and billions of dollars of savings from the existing budget. The things that that most of our money goes to, whether that's healthcare or public schools money, or higher education or spending on the environment, are things that the voters want us to do, and we have very fresh information from the elections in November with voters saying, we want you to spend more money on public schools and on child care and on environmental protection and on long-term care, and we're willing to pay for it, right? So it would seem very perverse for us then to turn around and start cutting the budget. So I think we are in the process now of exploring other ways to raise revenue that would not only fund the services that the people have told us they want, but would also help to continue our journey toward making the tax system more fair and making sure that wealthy people and wealthy companies who can afford to pay more for the services that we all want do their fair share in that work. So that is the primary work that is ahead of us for this session, and lots of other things that we'll be working on as well. But I look forward to the conversation this morning. I always learn from you all and from the things that are on your minds and that come from your experience. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Look forward to talking with you.
Senator Pedersen, and I'd like to introduce you to Representative-elect Shaun Scott, who, as Senator Pedersen mentioned, has taken over for Frank Chopp, who represented us since 1994. So it's a long, and 20 of those years was as the Speaker of the House. So Representative Scott is really no stranger to Olympia. He has worked closely, certainly with Representative Chopp on a number of issues, helping to create the Working Families Tax Credit and the state capital gains tax, the House portion of that. Obviously, lots of others worked on that, but those are two very key issues that he worked on. He has not yet been assigned to a House committee that I'm aware of. I think it's a little early. Possibly he can address that, but now I'd like to have you welcome our new Representative-elect, Shaun Scott.
It's great to be back at Horizon House, Senator. Good to be with you. It is true that Representative Chopp has gone from being I think one of the most influential politicians in the Washington State Legislature to being certainly one of Jamie and I's most influential constituents. Such a strong foundation that he laid for over many years in the state legislature, a champion of education, a champion of health and human services, a champion of really many of the same programs that are in peril as a result of the budgetary situation that Senator Pedersen outlined. To provide a little bit more detail, recently the governor's office circulated, or the Office of Financial Management circulated a memo to some 50, 60 state agencies in the state of Washington, asking them about what are some potential areas for savings, where can we help to reduce budgetary spending, and many of those cuts are actually very, very drastic potential cuts. They are potential cuts to Health and Human Services, to the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. I'm somebody who went to the University of Washington, so I was happy to see UW join in with our other 8 or 9 state colleges, and including Wazoo, and saying we're actually still feeling the budgetary crunch from the last recessionary cycle in 2009, 2010, 2011, and we're just getting on our feet as a result of cuts that were made at that time. So we really are not in a position to be reducing spending on higher education. So this is going to require us, I think, to have some very creative solutions. Certainly, as the senator mentioned, voters explained very, very clearly the direction they would like to see us go in. I'm happy to say that we won our election. I won my election in the 43rd LD by roughly the same margin that Washington State voters elected to retain our capital gains tax. I think that is significant. In the course of the campaign trail, it really was not about my campaign. It was about doing everything that we could to fully fund services that we all use, public schools, social safety net spending. And voters in the 43rd Legislative District have historically played a very important role in setting the pace for what it means to be a progressive in the state legislature. That's not going discontinue with my election. I think we want to make sure that we keep our foot on the gas pedal and understand that now is really not going to be the time for austerity budgeting. The majority of the potential cuts that we would be seeing would not be to constitutionally mandated spending of various kinds. It's going to be to discretionary. It would potentially be to discretionary social safety net and health and human services spending. So it narrows the terrain, and I think it focuses our rhetorical strategy in understanding that this is not a conversation about quote-unquote revenue, quote-unquote cuts. It's a conversation about values. If a budget can be a moral document that reflects priorities, it can also be an immoral document that reflects our unwillingness to make sure that we're putting the onus on people who have the most resources to help us state out and help us do what we need to do right by the people of our state. So I look forward to a robust discussion with everybody about the challenges that are facing us in the next few years.
We have a number of mic runners that we'd like to look to all of you to ask any questions. And I see Bill Jones in the back. Bill?
Did this deficit just creep up on you? Or why? Why do we have the deficit?
So there are a couple of reasons. So first of all, we are sort of an outlier among states in requiring budgets to balance over a 4-year period. Okay, so in a sense, we're better prepared. We're looking out further than many other states do that budget 1 or 2 years at a time. So we're getting early warning of a problem. One of the consequences, I will say, of that 4-year balanced budget process that has been in effect for, 10 years or so at this point, is that people sometimes play a little bit of a game in terms of spending. So they will, when they introduce a new program, they will ramp the spending up so that it'll be 10% in years 1 and 2, and then 25% in years 3 and 4, which are all that count for purposes of our 4-year balanced budget. And then the spending jumps up to 50% or 70% in years 5 and 6, and then to 100% in years 7 and 8. And an example of that is what happened with the Fair Start for Kids Act that we passed in 2021. That is a significant investment in child care and early learning that goes up over time. So, of course, what happened when we did the budget, the most recent supplemental budget in 2024, our years that we were looking at were fiscal years 25, 26, 27, and 28. Now, as we are preparing for the next session, the years that we have to look at are 25, 26, 26, 27, 28, and 29. With that additional spending, that's part of the ramp. Another part of what happened is that the world became atypical during the pandemic in a whole variety of ways. One of the ways in which it became atypical was people's spending patterns. And remember that Washington, because of our bad tax system, gets about 50% of our income from sales tax. Now, if you think about sales tax is not applied on everything that people spend money on. It applies to goods, most goods, but not to services for the most part. During the pandemic, during the early part of the pandemic, sales of goods, while everyone was trapped at home and couldn't spend on services, went up substantially. Sales of services plummeted. And so we started to feel like there was a pattern in place of higher sales tax revenues, and those are the assumptions on which we built the budget. Now, as the world has returned to something more like we believe is normal, those sales have balanced out, so more non-taxable services, fewer taxable goods. And the revenue curve, although it's not going down, the revenue curve has gone from looking like this to looking much more flat. So that's a chunk of what has happened. I would say the third component is that as a result of the sustained period of inflation, many of the state workers have bargained for meaningful increases in their compensation. And we, of course, haven't voted on those. We'll vote on those proposed increases in the legislative session. But of the, if it's $12 billion, roughly $3 billion of the additional shortfall comes from paying our employees fairly, which, given the inflation that we've all experienced, seems fair. So that's in rough terms, that accounts for most of the deficit or shortfall that has shown up what seems like suddenly.
Other questions? Doris Ray. Just a second, I'm sorry.
Hello?
Next.
Yes. Almost every morning, I turn on the local TV while I'm eating breakfast, and I hear a new report about one or more persons being shot within the last 24 hours. As a Democrat whose party control you have in the legislature, what kind of gun legislation will you support to improve our safety and limit gun violence?
Right. Well, this is one of the most important issues that I think are going to be in front of state lawmakers in the years to come, unfortunately. One of the things that I believe we would like to see is an increased push to make sure that people who are more likely to use firearms on people who are close to them, proximal to them, people who are their family members with, people who live in their same neighborhoods, communities, get guns out of the hands of those folks. It is the case that one of the clearest kind of proxy indicators that we have of likelihood of somebody who would perpetuate gun violence is whether or not there's somebody who has a domestic violence charge in their past. And a lot of the gun violence, as much as we do see those horrific stories, which have unfortunately become all too common, not only locally but also nationally, of people, taking a gun, using it in a public place. Most of the gun violence that we see is either the result of intimate partner violence or, once again, a situation where people are using those guns on folks that are proximal to them. So if we can sort of get a clearer understanding of some of those patterns, I think using the legislative tools that we have to make sure that guns are out of the hands of people who are most likely to use them on people who are close to them is one of the most effective things that we can continue to do.
I'll just add that one of the top priority for the Alliance for Gun Responsibility this coming session is going to be a permit to purchase system in which before someone is allowed to purchase a firearm, they have to get a permit, which involves a robust background check process that would, for example, look at the whether there are protection orders in place or any history of disqualifying domestic violence or other criminal activity, and then a waiting period while that happens so that people can cool down and not be purchasing firearms while they're in an excited state. So that's what the data tell us from other states is one of the most effective means of reducing gun violence. And hopefully by the end of this session, that's something that we will have in place in Washington as well.
Nancy.
Yes, I was going through Legiscam to find out about the filings that you have, and one of the three issues that I was exploring was guns. And my question concerns Senate Bill 5056, which it says, concerning Washington State Patrol providing firearm background checks when state record systems are unavailable. And my question is, why?
So I'm going to confess right away, I have not looked at that bill yet. One of the things that we experienced here in the last couple of months is that there was a cyber attack on the administrative office of the courts in our state. And happily, because the courts' IT folks shut down the system pretty quickly, there was not significant damage done. So unlike in some other jurisdictions around the country where literally the courts have been shut down for months, our outage lasted about 2 weeks, and then they had the system back up and running. During that time, however, the courts were unable to participate in providing information that's required for background checks in our state. So I'm guessing that whoever dropped that bill was looking at a way essentially to make sure that people could still buy guns during a time when the court systems were unavailable. In my opinion, maybe they could just wait. But we'll see what happens. I will say, as a general matter, some of the bills that get filed during the pre-filing period are filed because they've been really well worked with a lot of stakeholders and they're ready to go. And so, you can assume that those will wind up on the governor's desk with close to unanimous votes. Many of the bills that are pre-filed are bills that will never go anywhere in the legislature and are filed to get a little bit of public attention during a period where we're not yet doing anything, and the press is very hungry for political news stories. So I think some of the things that are alarming, there are some anti-transgender bills that have been dropped, for example, that are never going to get a public hearing, let alone pass a chamber. So I wouldn't, as a general matter, get too stirred up about anything that you see in pre-filing until you see something actually scheduled for hearing.
All right, Sally.
I want to get back to revenue.
No,
What kind of new revenues are you folks looking at to help with this budget?
Right. So I did want to issue a kind of a point of clarification here. I actually have been assigned to 3 committees. One of those is the House Finance Committee. I'm also going to be serving as vice chair of the Washington State Labor and Workplace Standards Committee in the House, and the House Committee on Education as well. In all 3 of those committees, the question of economic justice is front and center. The question of new revenue is front and center. I like to say that it's the question of fully funding the programs and the services that we all use, just because that takes it out of the abstract. And this is really the Frank Chopp school of, I think, persuasion with respect to progressive revenue. When you start the conversation off talking about increasing a threshold on a capital gains tax or a business and occupation surcharge expansion, or closing corporate tax loopholes, all of which are proposals that are being mulled at present in the House Finance Committee, there's a tendency, I think, to try to build a political case on a negative. You're starting with the word tax, which already carries a negative connotation for most folks. When, however, the discussion starts off by saying we want to fund mental and behavioral health services, we want to fund affordable and social housing so that everybody can have a roof over their heads, we want to make sure that every child in a Washington State school has all the resources that they need to learn and grow, become self-actualized in public schools. Suddenly it becomes a lot harder for people, I think, to disagree with the general gist. And then and only then will you talk about what the revenue source might be. So some of those revenue sources that I mentioned earlier are taxes, in essence, on wealth, the capital assets ownership tax, for example. Our principle, and what we're really going to be holding the line by in the House Finance Committee, is the notion that part of the reason why we are in the current mess that we are in is because we have relied for too long on regressive sales taxes, which, if you go back and read the history of the 1930s in the state legislature, was never supposed to be a permanent way of funding the programs that we use. Those were stopgaps that were implemented after our state income tax was overturned by the state Supreme Court. And so as a matter of just kind of stalling and figuring it out, the state legislature issued a number of taxes that we still have with us, which are regressive sales taxes. And so if we had taken action on this issue earlier, to the spirit of the gentleman's question that you asked earlier about how we got into this mess, if we had taken action on creating a more progressive tax structure earlier, a lot of the issues that are facing us at present would not be certainly as drastic. One last point, we have talked a little bit about sort of some of the labor costs that have been that have escalated as a result of collective bargaining agreements that the state has signed, worker participation and activity and an uptick in that in recent years. We want to make sure that this focus on the revenue conversation does not amount to us trying to raid public pension programs, for example, that people still depend on, workers that are just getting into the system are going to depend on. And so this focus on the revenue conversation is really one that impacts almost every aspect of our state, if not materially, then definitely philosophically, and what our values are as Democrats in the state legislature.
All right, well, the question, Ned?
Oh, can I?
I'm
I'll just add a little bit for Nancy's question. You may have heard from Nick on this. In addition to the wealth tax or capital assets ownership tax, as Representative-elect Scott said, one of the big proposals that we're mulling through in the Senate is an expansion statewide of something like the Seattle Jump Start tax. So a tax on employers for the payroll that they pay above the Social Security cap. So if you're paying an employee up to $168,800 per year, the employer already has to pay 6.2% in Social Security tax to the federal government, but then that stops at that point. So the employer's costs actually go down for compensation above that amount. This proposal would, at the state level, continue that tax on up to infinity for high compensation. What the Office of Financial Management tells us is that if we were to extend that statewide, that we could raise in the neighborhood of $5 billion per year on large employers. Now, the downside is we're already hearing rumblings from Boeing and Microsoft and Amazon that they will move jobs out of state. But, as we consider a variety of difficult alternatives, that's one that seems worth considering. I will note that in the years since the Seattle tax went into effect, with some exceptions, we've generally seen employers continue to maintain their employment base in the city, and revenues have every year consistently outstripped what was originally proposed or what was originally anticipated. So we think that's also a revenue source that's worth exploring. I wholeheartedly agree with Representative-elect Scott about the need to start with what we have to fund. And from my perspective, that really starts with public schools and the problems that we're facing there.
Okay, Ned?
Is a net income tax even on your table? And if so, or if not, why not?
So in September of 1933, the Washington State Supreme Court essentially outlawed the potential of an income tax in Washington State. Voters in an initiative in the previous November of 1932, I believe that was the same election cycle that we pledged our delegates here in Washington State to send FDR to the White House. In that same election cycle had approved an income tax by quite a wide margin. That was a coalition in the 30s that was led by teachers, the unemployed urban poor, and farmers, all of whom had sort of built a statewide coalition, not too dissimilar from the one that we would probably need to see to get a similar kind of wealth tax passed today. It was a great 10 months when we did have that income tax as it was getting ready to be implemented in the 30s, but as a result of that state Supreme Court decision that followed a year later in September of 1933, that is not an option that we are currently going to be able to explore, at least not within the bounds of state law. That does not mean that we can't get at something like what an income tax would provide us revenue-wise. The general idea of a wealth tax is certainly something that I think you're hearing from both myself and the senator. We're going to be exploring with vigor in the years to come and in the session that's in front of us. I've also in the Finance Committee have been attempting to sort of raise the issue of corporate tax deferments. The State Department of Revenue actually forgoes much more revenue than it collects. And that's just a fancy way of saying there are all kinds of carve-outs, loopholes, deferments for very, very large companies that we have made. Some of those to dubious impact. We have a large tax deferment, for example, for tech companies that were supposed to have provided a number of jobs through certain state data centers that amounts to about $125 million of revenue that we forsake. The jobs that were supposed to have been provided as of that result of that deferment, it came out in the Seattle Times earlier this year, didn't necessarily materialize, and yet the subsidy is still on the books. We have a subsidy for a very large opioid companies that benefits 3 companies in specific that would potentially grant us another $50 or $60 million of revenue of a year for behavioral health services. So though an income tax is not something that we can pursue, at least not legally, there have been many attempts to sort of through statewide initiatives and things of that nature, which is an important facet of our democracy in Washington State, the fact that we have citizen participation on that level. There's still a lot that we can be doing to make sure that we're collecting the revenue that we need to fund the services that we all use that can get us in the direction of what an income tax would provide us were it legal.
Okay.
My question
Well,
My
Sally.
question was, growing up on a farm for 13 years, I'm concerned about our farm workers and the food price. I see in the latest paper that the Panama Canal is no longer viable for the big ships, so they're now going around, which will take longer, and food costs will go up. But I'm really concerned about, does our state legislation and Senate have, or governor, have the power to fight having our farm workers deported? Or any say on that?
We have limited ability to do anything about the federal government. What I will say is that we passed a bill during the first Trump administration called Keep Washington Working. And the purpose of that was essentially to say that the resources of the state government and local governments in our state, including police, the prison system, all of our public safety apparatus, and courts, are not going to be made available to the federal government's immigration enforcement. So that law is in effect, and we won't be participating in those efforts. Now, that doesn't mean that the federal government can't put its resources here, and it also doesn't mean that the president can't potentially call out our National Guard to participate. I mean, we have no idea exactly what President-elect Trump is planning to do, but I think we have both had the opportunity to do significant preparation, because this has been a long theme of his, and we are absolutely standing by to see what else we might need to do to protect residents of our state, regardless of their immigration status.
I want to take just very briefly on that question, if I may. So we have some sense of the general GOP's direction that they want to take the country in as a result of a very detailed and poorly written plan called Project 2025, which we heard a lot about in the election cycle this year. That is a plan that will include potentially dismantling, if not significantly defanging, the Department of Education. It is a plan that will include eroding labor rights as they were handed down and passed and fought for through the National Labor Review Board. That is a plan that could potentially be really devastating for federal funding that we have come to be accustomed to for a few vital services. And the question in specific of what we're doing for agricultural and farm workers, I think, is a very important one, because this has been a long-standing sort of tension in our state, the fact that so many labor laws that might apply to somebody who's a cook or a janitorial worker do not necessarily apply to a lot of our agricultural workers. That's something that we want to amend and fix. And so in the Labor Committee, we have been having discussions about what it would look like to either stand up a local statewide analog to the NLRB in the event that it is dismantled or defanged. And at the very least, tracking sort of the developments that we see from the Trump NLRB and understanding that there might be labor rights that are stricken down at the federal level that we need to uphold at the local level. So that is a vital conversation that we are definitely paying attention to in the House on the Labor Committee.
After the last month's presidential election, I, along with many people, asked, how did this come about? And I came up with an answer for myself. And I wasn't going to mention anything about this at all until I read this morning's Seattle Times, which had an article about the huge disparity, particularly in Seattle, between the people who have and the people who have not.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that that's the crucial issue for the country, and it may be more of an issue here than we suspect because there are so many people who have in Washington.
Right.
I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, as somebody who was born in, and I want to be really careful in saying this, as somebody who was born in 1984, I have really not had the experience in my lifetime of seeing, in my political adulthood, right, which my first vote that I cast was in the 2004 presidential election. I've really not seen in my lifetime a functioning GOP that seems committed to the welfare of the country despite deep-seated ideological differences that might exist with the other party. Most of the experiences that I have with that level of competency on the other side of the aisle comes to me through history. Understanding that, Jim Ellis, who was somebody who was probably one of the most influential Seattleites that we have ever had, was somebody who was a registered Republican who at one point in time may have been vacuumed up into Richard Nixon's EPA, but decided he would rather stay here and help us invest in parks and mass transit. And so what I think about is the fact that we have sort of turned away from the idea that government can be responsible for grand, ambitious programs. It takes us longer now to put a subway in the dirt than it did a number of decades ago to put somebody on the moon, which I think is unfortunate. So you do wonder where sort of the aspiration, the ambition has been. And when you have, I think, a recession from the idea of the public trust and the idea that we can do great things together, people are more likely to be divided on a number of issues which might be significant, but oftentimes are pet issues. Right now, collectively, we need to be thinking about how we're going to fully fund healthcare nationwide, protect colleges and universities nationwide, what we're going to do for infrastructure nationwide. But there was a sense, I think, among many voters that Democrats somehow represented more keeping institutions and propping up institutions that weren't working for folks, whereas Republicans were going to be the party of change. That was disadvantageous framing for us, to say the least, at the national level, but we should feel fortified that at the state level, you had many states that may have pledged their delegates to, or their electoral college votes to President Trump in the same election cycle where they voted for an increase in the minimum wage or voted for a progressive governor or statewide initiative policy at the same time that they voted for Trump to be their president. So I think that there's a general disaffection with status quo politics generally. And when we get to the frame of mind, I think as Democrats, that we're sort of in this to make sure that we're pushing for policies that are going to help people, we're going to do a lot better than we will when we're sort of on the defensive on a number of these questions.
I will just add a little bit. Generally agreeing, Washington's results in the election were pretty different from what we saw elsewhere in the state. Not only did we elect Democrats to every single statewide office for the first time since 1944, but we also increased the Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate to the point where we now have 60% supermajorities in both chambers. And in what could only be described as a referendum on a lot of the progressive policy that we have done over the last 6 or 7 years, the voters approved 3 big initiatives into which millions of dollars of conservative money had been poured to try to undo our progress on carbon emissions, our progress on long-term care, and our progress on both education funding and rebalancing the tax code. I'm particularly heartened that on the Climate Commitment Act, Initiative 2117, and on the capital gains tax 2109, the voters by almost 2/3 majorities upheld those programs and upheld our work. So I think the signal that I take from those votes in our state is that when you stay focused on what the people need, what they're asking for from us, and then provide a fair way to pay for it, that the voters are going to continue to back our policies. So I'm hopeful that not only are we seeing and hearing an affirmation of what we've been doing, but that we might help point the way forward for the country as a whole. Thank you.
You have a person here?
Thank you. Tom Spiro here. Switching to environmental protection,
Put it up here.
Shaun Scott, could you tell us what's going to happen with the REWRAP Act, the act which would have extended producer responsibility for the packaging, which we were all swamped with? Here at Horizon House, we are trying very hard to be responsible and recycle and compost, but statewide, the problem of plastic litter is a huge problem, and it seems only fair for the producers of that litter to take responsibility for cleaning it up.
It's a great question. I will confess I'm not familiar with the specific details of the legislation that you mentioned, except to say that it does sound like something that will probably be making its way through our Consumer Protections and Business Committee. So I will track, though I'm not serving on that committee, I will definitely track the conversation that takes place there. I will say, as a general point, it was really great to see the voters of Washington State uphold the Climate Commitment Act. The senator mentioned the immense amount of corporate money that went into that potential repeal. It was good to see Washington State voters reaffirm our commitment to being indeed the evergreen state, and understanding that that is a title that we earn not just through passive appreciation for the environment, but active stewardship of it as well. So I will be following with great interest the legislation that you mentioned, and this is honestly the first time that I've been hearing about it in specific.
I will just add a little bit about the REWRAP Act. So the Representative Berry, who is our neighbor, Queen Anne Magnolia Ballard, is the prime sponsor of the REWRAP Act in the House. This year, my understanding is that the environmental community plans to divide that proposal into 2 pieces. So one piece will focus on glass recycling and implement a charge like Oregon has that you can deposit essentially on glass bottles that you can get back. The experience in states that have that sort of a deposit and return policy is that there becomes dramatic compliance in terms of recycling. So it seems likely that there's a good path for that forward in our state. The rest of the REWRAP Act, which would create this extended producer responsibility system, essentially having packagers pay into helping increase recycling availability and compliance, is the top priority, I think, for the Environmental Priorities Coalition. And I think we are strongly interested in trying to work through that. Now, what I'll say is that the primary opponents over the last few years that we've been talking about, originally the RAP Act and then the REWRAP Act, have been the haulers, the people who collect the recycling, because I think that they're concerned that if you take out some of the profitable waste streams from their recycling. You know, right now we have one bin that you put everything into, that it will become even more difficult to make it work economically to recycle some of the harder to recycle items like the plastic bottles and plastic containers. So that'll continue to be a discussion. But I think we have large alignment about the objective, and we'll be working hard on that in the upcoming session. Thank you.
Do you have any? Okay. Laura?
Yeah. Thank you. Back to revenue. I had a couple of questions. First is just a comment that the idea that an income tax, state income tax, is unconstitutional is contested by many people, including some law professors and so on, and that this Supreme Court would rule differently if they had a case on the constitutionality of an income tax. But the other question has to do with, is there any long-term consideration now of what we could do to reform our state tax system? I understand there's more of a consensus now around the wealth tax and possibly the jumpstart tax, but that's still taxing, at least the wealth tax would, very small number of very wealthy people. And most states have a graduated state net income tax. And is there any possibility that we'll be looking at reform which reduces sales tax, reforms the B&O, and brings in a hallelujah graduated state net income tax?
Right.
Thank you.
I mean, these are exactly the kinds of questions that I believe we need to be having now, and there's no time like the present to deal with an issue like this that I think would have impacted us greatly for the better were we to take it up, were we to have taken it up a little bit earlier. I'm going to be starting out on my career as a lawmaker, as a freshman lawmaker coming up for the first time this January. I understand, as we've talked about, the election results that we saw, I think, provided us with a pretty clear mandate that this is an issue that voters want to see real progress on. My feeling is that we get to a better place on these discussions where we are talking about, when we are talking about which programs exactly we would like to fund, and on an issue-by-issue basis. One of the largest, if not the largest, state expenditure that we have is in the realm of education. You would really like to see some of these revenue conversations sort of influence the way that we're funding our state schools at present. Our funding model was actually devised by Senate Republicans in 2017. It was designed to be a revenue neutral model that did not incorporate much progressive revenue. The austerity mindset that I believe that was contained within that prototypical funding model for our schools has been evidenced in the fact that the amount of funding that we have dedicated to our schools has declined relative to a proportion of overall state funding. There are a number of things that we can do, giving localities more latitude as far as raising their own taxes through local property tax levies, things of that nature. But I continue to think that specifically in the realm of education, just because it's a topic that I'm very passionate about, and materially it is one where we're making our greatest state expenditures, that I think that when we make progress on the issue of progressive revenue on that front in particular, it's going to kind of open a lot of eyes, and people are going to realize we fully funded education with taxes on the wealthy. The sky did not fall. Maybe we ought to try to do the same thing for health and human services, for behavioral health, for a number of other programs that are very vital for our state as well.
So I will add a few things. First of all, I want to have a slight nuance. It's not that an income tax is unconstitutional. We could tax income. What the Supreme Court said in the case to which Representative Scott was referring is that income is a form of property, and so the constitutional limits on property taxes apply to income taxes. So the two most important are, number one, that it's capped at 1%, You could not have an income tax in excess of 1% of someone's income. And then secondly, that it has to be a uniform tax. So it has to be the same rate regardless of the level of income. It can't be a progressive income tax where the rates go up as the income goes up. Those two things have made it, as a practical matter, useless for us to pursue an income tax because it wouldn't raise that much money compared to the heartache that it would give us with the voters, and the fact that it would not be particularly progressive. So, those of you who have been listening to me for some years will remember that for many years, as I was talking about the capital gains tax, one of the benefits that I saw from the capital gains tax is that there would be a legal challenge to that would go to the Supreme Court. And I am one of those people who believe that if the Supreme Court had a case in front of it now about the constitutionality of an income tax, that the 9 justices who are currently serving would come to a different conclusion than the justices who considered that in the 1930s and again in the 1950s. Unfortunately, when that case got to them, the case challenging the capital gains tax, the Supreme Court determined that the legislature had correctly identified the capital gains tax as an excise tax and not a property tax. And as a result, they did not reach the question of whether the capital gains tax was a property tax, whether their previous cases should be overruled. So we're back. I think we can continue to try to come up with a creative way to get a case in front of them. But in the meantime, I agree wholeheartedly with Representative-elect Scott that it's more productive probably for us to think about other ways to achieve the same economic outcome of having people who are more capable of paying do that work for us. The last thing that I'll say is the other way around that would be, of course, to do a constitutional amendment. We had a moment this fall where we hoped that we might get to 2/3 majorities and not merely 60% supermajorities in the legislature, and that just didn't materialize. We have absolutely zero interest from the Republicans in our state in facilitating conversations about making taxes more progressive. So we are, for the foreseeable future, going to have to work within the structure that we have.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. A lot of what you're talking about sounds to me like the budget decisions are an exercise of harm reduction. Where can you make these decisions in a way, or how can you make these decisions in a way that will lead to less harm in whatever area you're considering? And I'm looking at the Fair Start situation as an example. Here in Seattle, we have a budget problem also in the city budget. And one of the ways that the city council is considering plugging those gaps is to take our equivalent to Fair Start, which was designed to address a number of other progressive issues, and using the fact that it generated more revenue than I thought it would generate, that they've passed a measure in the council that allows them to move that money in different ways. And I'm so concerned about the amount of harm that these budget cuts could potentially mean to, particularly, for example, early childhood education, which we all know begins in infancy. It doesn't begin in K. And how we can shape the discussion so that as you find ways of plugging some of these holes in the budget, there is an expectation that moving forward, if you generate more revenue than you think you might, one of these ways, those revenues will still not be diverted in ways that were not intended when that revenue measure was passed. Am I being clear, or am I being just too abstruse?
It's very clear. The situation with respect to the Jumpstart tax is one where a more progressive City Council took the same kinds of action at the city level that I think many would like to see the state continue to take. And that was a tax that was actually passed with consensus from a wide enough sector of the business community in the city of Seattle. It is unfortunate to see that fund being diverted. And when we're talking about what these, it's very difficult to have a conception of what hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion of revenue might actually mean. So I always try to recenter what that human impact actually looks like. We talked earlier about the Office of Financial Management's memo that was sent to state agencies asking them where could they expect to potentially exercise some cost savings. Some of the responses to that memo that we got from state agencies were pretty troubling. There's a potential for a $2 million cut from the Utilities and Transportation Commission on wildfire mitigation planning, another $3.1 million in child care benefits for trades workers, $197,000 for bridge and dam safety in the state of Washington, and the Center for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Youth, another $120,000 because they believed they could save that money by shortening a 2-day statewide conference for disabled students in Washington state to 1 day. Those are the kinds of decisions that are in front of too many state agencies that are going to they're very shortly going to be impacting Washington state families, kids, parents, students, educators, houseless residents, working people in our state. And so we have to continue to center this as a values conversation, not only as a financial issue. I think that's part of where the narrative was lost on protecting the Jumpstart funds, because we got into this abstract of talking about $800 million, $700 million. We needed to center the conversation, I believe, at the local level on the fact that that money was going to be diverted from refugee assistance, it was going to be diverted from affordable housing, from environmental programs, and I think that the terrain on which we sort of waged that fight for progressive revenue would have been a lot more favorable to us were we to center the human impact, and that's something that we want to be committed to, certainly in the House Finance Committee, and also in the Labor Committee, where a lot of these issues are going to be talking about, are going to be in front of us as well, as far as making sure that we're taking care of working and everyday people in our state as well.
Other questions?
I
Nancy?
have one very quick one. Hot topic around my table when I get together with my family. What is happening with stabilization of rents?
The voters in 2024 have now elected a legislature that I believe will pass a rent stabilization bill in this upcoming session. I think there is and continues to be a legitimate concern about the long-term effect that will have on housing supply and on capital investment in building more rental housing in our state. And I guess I'll say that there's no world that I can imagine, maybe I lack imagination, but there's no world that I can imagine in which the public sector is going to be able to provide enough housing units to satisfy all the demand that we have. So we will continue to rely on the private sector, and it's important that we think about and try to balance that potential negative effect on supply. So yes is the answer. I think we will likely enact some form of rent stabilization in the upcoming session. We will also be looking at a broad package of housing measures that I hope will create even more housing. And in the long run, that's what will help contain housing prices, both for single-family homes and for multifamily housing, rental housing.
Bill, at the back.
Neil in the back.
Oh, all right. Neil.
Yeah, this is a question of priorities. This morning we've heard from you and we've heard from the audience questions about a whole wide variety of issues, all important. But where are you going? What are your priorities? What are you personally going to try to be working on in this session? Yeah.
My highest passion personally, which I'm happy to say is shared by my caucus, is public schools. I think we have very strong direction from the state constitution and from the voters that we need to be focused first and foremost on our paramount duty of providing amply for the education of all children in Washington. I have 4 kids at Garfield High School, and watched with dismay this year as the school board tried to wrestle with its shortfall and figure out all sorts of bad options about closing schools, which in my view would create a downward spiral for the whole system. I'm happy that they've pulled back from that. In part, they did that because we as a delegation made a commitment that we will go to Olympia and fight for increased funding for public schools. So that's where I would start. I think housing and behavioral health will also be significant focuses for us in the upcoming session. Thank you.
Well, I think we have such a dynamic district that we represent where you could scarcely think of any issue that you might go to Olympia with as a priority that does not impact in some way, shape, or form one of the most diverse, the most dense legislative districts in the state of Washington. We were talking a little bit about rent stabilization, certainly making sure that we're doing right by our district of renters, 72% renters in the 43rd LD. Very, very high priority. I believe that we've been talking a little bit about election results. I believe that part of the reason why we won our election, or I won my election this past November, was because of those stalwart renter neighborhoods like Capitol Hill, Fremont. But the reason why we won it by a lot, I think, had to do with the discussion around public schools and the fact that we did make it, I tried to make it as clear as possible that I thought that the revenue conversation was a values conversation. It was one about making sure that we were fully funding our schools for families in Washington state. It was explained to me that there are invisible hands when you get to the state legislature as a freshman lawmaker that will sort of help you along in ways that will encourage you to continue filing for re-election and want to continue to serve as a state representative. That was something that I had heard. I saw it manifest when the top 3 priority committees that I applied for to our House caucus in finance, labor, and workplace standards and education were exactly the committees that I ended up getting to serve on. Those were deeply reflective of the issues that I tried to run on in the course of the campaign, understanding that we have the 3rd highest rates of unionization in Washington state. As the senator mentioned, on labor rights in specific, I think we can do a lot to point the way for the rest of the country about what it looks like to stand up for working people. The fact that we can be doing a lot to show that progressive revenue is central to funding the services, infrastructure, state programs that we all use. With respect to finance and education. I'm somebody who is a product of public schools, proud graduate of the University of Washington, studied under Professor Jim Gregory in the Civil Rights and Labor History Project 20 years ago. And I believe that sort of foundational civics education there was sort of a springboard for the wonderful opportunity that I have to serve the people of our district in the state legislature. So those policy priorities, I think, are reflective of how complex and diverse and vibrant our district actually is. And I believe that the 43rd LD contains the best of Washington state only because it's reflective of so many of the issues that are going to be facing our people statewide. And we want to take action on addressing as many of those as we can in this state session.
Bill Jones.
This has minimal impact upon us, but what about reproductive rights?
Well, when we talk about values and values as Democrats in the House of Representatives, one of the, I think, most unimpeachably popular political brands, if you will, that we have in Washington state is Planned Parenthood. When I was knocking doors at the farmers market, when I talked to people about what our campaign coalition was about, the support of the Planned Parenthood Alliance advocates was almost an immediate signal that this is somebody that's going to be sticking up for all people in our state. So it is unfortunate that when you go back and look at that list of proposed cuts that I've referenced a few times now, some of those potential cuts are going to be to reproductive services in our state. That's not what voters elected certainly their state lawmakers for. It's not what they elected Governor Bob Ferguson for. It's not in Washington State reflective of our values as a state that I think is going to be a real outlier in the age of Trump and standing up on a number of issues. So here again, we need to make sure that we're centering what it is that we need to be fully funding, making sure that those cuts to health and human services, which could include abortion access, do not happen, is really going to be central to us here in the state of Washington.
We have time, I believe, for a few more questions, so I see one from Ann Brand.
Hi, just to follow up, Jamie, on the education emphasis. What about the responsibility of the state in its fervor to support education to include nursery school age children?
So I am a strong supporter of early learning. I think the research is pretty convincing that when we invest there, that pays dividends throughout the lives of children. You know, I remember so vividly when my kids got to Stevens Elementary School, they had a sort of pre-day where they came in to get acclimated to kindergarten and meet their teachers. And Ms. Lemming, who was there, said to Ms. Luke, "Ms. Luke, we've got readers," about my younger boys. You know, that is absolutely the game. If by the time kids get to third grade, they can read fluently and they can do arithmetic, then they're really going to be set for the rest of their education. Whereas if they don't get to that point by the end of third grade, then you're going to be playing catch up through the whole rest of the system. And the key to whether you can get to that point is really what kind of educational opportunities the children have had before they get to kindergarten. So if you've got families that are well educated and have lots of resources, it's pretty easy for the kids to come to kindergarten well prepared and be off on a good journey through the system. If, on the other hand, you have families that are experiencing distress in one way or another and don't have access to those resources, then a public option for state-funded early learning that is of high quality and can help make up those deficits is really critical to success. Okay, so this is a long way of saying this is why I voted for the Fair Start for Kids Act. This is why this was a significant priority for us. And it is because it is not part of basic education. Representative-elect Scott referred before to this sort of funny situation we have in the budget where we have large chunks of the budget that are either constitutionally protected or federally mandated. So things like our K-12 basic education, things like our Medicaid services. So when you know, and then the courts and our election system, you know, you get a pretty good chunk of the budget that's essentially off limits for us to cut. So if you work from an austerity mindset about needing to do an all cuts budget, and this was the position that we were in during the Great Recession, then the discretionary parts of the budget, early learning, higher education, environmental protection, have to bear 100% of the cuts, right? And we are still recovering from some of those cuts that we made in an era when we could not raise revenue because a series of voter initiatives had said that it took 2/3 majorities of the legislature to pass taxes, and we had no partnership from the Republicans. So now, you know, again, those of you who have been around a while will remember that Speaker Lori Jenkins and Senator David Frocht, former, now a constituent, and I worked together to put together a lawsuit in 2012 that caused the Supreme Court, or gave the Supreme Court the opportunity, which it did take, to overturn those Tim Eyman initiatives. Now we have the opportunity to consider additional taxes and to balance that additional revenue with and the political and other downsides that come along with that, with the needs of people for those kinds of investments, such as early learning. So it is absolutely my hope that our balance will be much more on the side of additional revenue so that we can make the investments in our people and in particularly in our youngest learners that you're mentioning as part of the resolution of our budget shortfall. Thank you.
One right here. Ina.
I would like to thank you that you came, or that you continue to come. We've seen you here many times, but it is getting to the point in our political life that when we go to the doctor doesn't give us a pill for this, that, or the other. The doctor says, at least to me, turn off the television. That's going to be the best thing for your physical and mental health. So the fact that you come, that you spend the time, the effort, for whatever your reasons are, but for me personally, I can hear something that is positive, that you're doing something that is counterbalancing to that what I potentially would see on television. So thank you very, very much.
I think with that as an ending, it'd be a one, unless you have something else to say.
Well, I heard a question in there, actually.
Oh, you did.
I did. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the British sociologist, a fellow by the name of Robert Putnam, who wrote a very influential essay in 1995 called Bowling Alone. It was about the demise of sort of bowling as a civic activity, and so the author's general thesis was that because people no longer bowled as much as they did, you could sort of chart the decline in American participation in electoral politics. People were much more atomized, much less likely to join unions, less likely to vote. I've spent my life as a digital native, somebody who had most of their formative experiences online, but can also kind of remember a time before that was the case in my early adolescence. There's a lot that was lost sort of on the road to hoisting most of our interactions online, having most of our political information come not from our neighbors, from our peers, but from the Fox Newses of the world. So this is my 5th time showing up to Horizon House this year. I think you were saying that was a very eloquent way of saying that you're kind of sick of seeing me here at this point, but I'm going to continue to come just because this is what civic participation is. This is what it's supposed to look like. So it's an honor to be here with everybody.
I'm not quite as tall as Representative-elect Scott, so I keep standing up. I'll just say that part of the reason that I keep coming back, I mean, other than the fact that now I have many friends here, and some who have migrated here over the years, is that this kind of civic and civil discourse about how to face the challenges that we have in our state is really one of the most affirming reasons for why to do this work, right? The opportunity to engage with people of good faith who want to solve the challenges is really what makes this all satisfying. And I think, part of the reason why I continue to run and continue to serve is that it is a huge privilege to be in a position where you can help thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people by careful thought and then good, solid decision making. And so I'm so grateful to all of you for that wellspring of support that continues to propel me forward in this work that I am doing. Thank you.
With that, I think that we've had a really good hour and 20 minutes of good civic discussion. So thank you all for coming, and certainly thank you, Senator, and you, Representative Scott, for your time. Thanks, all of you.